All right, welcome to the start of week two, as well as the beginning of our lectures on Buddhism as a form of ancient philosophy that is non-Western in character. We will continue our coverage of Buddhism for Wednesday's lectures, so please read pages 43 to 45 in the textbook before then. There is often a tendency in Western approaches to Buddhism to homogenize it, to make it a monolith, that is, to treat all Buddhism as one fundamental or essential thing, as opposed to possessing a variety of dimensions, complex nuances, and various aspects to itself. Just as in, Christianity, which I'm assuming many of you are already familiar with as a religious organization or as a religious ideology. Buddhism also possesses divisions within itself between various kinds. So we should not approach Buddhism as some singular entity that can be grasped in its entirety in two lectures or in one lecture. Buddhism is as complex in its history, in its religious dogma, in its cultural and historical expressions as any other world historical religion, like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and so on. Now, we are not as concerned with the religious dimensions of Buddhism. We're far more concerned with the philosophical dimensions. But one difficulty of concerning ourselves with a system of thought like Buddhism is that the philosophical and religious elements are greatly intertwined with one another. They're inextricably tied together. So that makes it more difficult to understand the philosophical upshots of Buddhism without the religious metaphysical backing in the background, such as beliefs in the reincarnation of the self, right? Or beliefs in the existence of nirvana, right? Which is either an imminent state of perfection and bliss and happiness, or it describes a transcendent locale to which one ascends after escaping the cycle of reincarnation, which is known as samsara. So, as a disclaimer at the top, I simply say Buddhist philosophy is complex, diverse, and nuanced. We are only concerned with the broad overview of Buddhist principles, including a brief glance into Mahayana Buddhism. So, there are three main divisions of Buddhism as far as we're concerned. First is Theravada, which was the original type of Buddhism, originating in the South Asian subcontinent of India. And those individuals who subscribe to Theravada, who still exist today, but they are massively dwarfed by the much larger branch of Buddhism known as Mahayana. Those individuals who subscribe to Theravada or are adherents to it strive for individual liberation from the cycle of reincarnation. Buddhists, like other religions that emerged from Southern Asia, from the South Asian subcontinent of India, such as Hinduism and Jainism, also believe in reincarnation and the desire to overcome or liberate oneself from that reincarnation. That is very much central to the belief systems of South Asian philosophies and religions. Additionally, another accompanying belief is the desire or the intention to eliminate suffering, right? To stop all suffering from occurring. So many of these South Asian philosophical and religious systems ask the question, how do we end suffering for ourselves? And you will notice very quickly from the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism that we are occupied with that very question. That we have to assert that there is such a thing as suffering. We have to assert that it has a beginning, it has an end, and that there is a middle path, Madhyamaka. There is a way for us to overcome that suffering in this life. Okay, or over the course of several generations of lives throughout our reincarnated selves. Okay, so Theravada is known as the lesser wheel or vehicle. It's focused on individual salvation. That makes sense, and the fact that Theravada is now no longer the predominant or popular form of Buddhism makes sense insofar as if Theravada Buddhists are only concerned with themselves and Mahayana Buddhists are concerned with universal salvation, that is, the liberation of all sentient beings from the cycle of reincarnation, then it makes sense that Mahayana has spread itself, disseminated itself further than Theravada has. Okay. Mahayana is translated something like the greater wheel or vehicle, and it's focused on universal salvation. In the various strains of Mahayana that one can study, you will find the figure of the Bodhisattva in Buddhism. And the Bodhisattva is is the figure who purposefully delays reincarnation of themselves, who purposefully delays liberation from reincarnation for themselves in order to save all sentient beings before themselves. So the bodhisattva is the highest figure of compassion and wisdom and considerateness for others, insofar as you are willing to purposefully rebirth yourself into future lives and place yourself into further occasions of suffering in order for in order for all sentient beings, not only human beings, but all sentient beings to be liberated. Okay, so that's Mahayana. What's also called, so we have the lesser vehicle, the greater vehicle, and sometimes scholars of Buddhism refer to Tibetan Buddhism in particular as the diamond vehicle. In Tibetan Buddhism, you find the Dalai Lama, who is the Avalokiteshvara, or the Bodhisattva of compassion. That is the one who delays liberation from reincarnation until all sentient beings are liberated. Tibetan Buddhism is focused on universal salvation. It possesses the figure of the Dalai Lama, who is sort of the central bodhisattva who continually reincarnates himself in order to then assist individuals in achieving that liberation. Dalai Lama means oceanic guru, Dali being, um, I believe, the oceanic part, in Lama being guru. And the Tibetan Buddhist outlook is also influenced by the Bon indigenous religion, with which, when the South Asian philosophical and religious system of Buddhism migrated northward and northeast into East Asia, it obviously combined itself with other existing formations of religion in the Chinese context, Taoism and Confucianism; in the Japanese context, Shintoism; in the Tibetan context, this Bon indigenous religion, which involved the existence of demons and spirits and the enchantment of the natural world around us. So in Tibetan Buddhism, you will find monks, Buddhist monks, who act as if they are priests in our Western Catholic or Christian context, who bless, who exorcise demons from, from the natural world, from human beings, and so on. So Tibetan Buddhism is special in that regard. It is a unique product of the syncretism meaning just the blending, the mixing of different religious systems, the syncretism of Buddhism and indigenous religions in East Asia. Various concepts are found within Buddhism that are found in other South Asian systems, including Hinduism and Jainism. Hinduism is an older form of religious and philosophical thinking than Buddhism. Buddhism emerges sometime around the 6th or 5th century BCE, whereas Hinduism can be traced almost, in some cases, 1,000 to 2,000 years before that. So 2,500 BCE, 1,500 BCE. It depends on how you understand the historical trajectory of the Aryans who migrated south from from like West Russian area, who migrated south to the South Asian subcontinent and settled there, and through that migration and settlement interaction with those individuals who were already existed in South Asia, that produced Hinduism. And then thousands of years later, or at least 1,000 years later, Buddhism arrives on the scene. Okay, so Buddhism must always be understood in a sense against the background of South Asian religion and philosophy, in particular Hinduism. Jainism also plays a role that we will discuss. The main principle of Jainism is do no harm, and it endorses an extreme asceticism or form of self-denial that you're not supposed to eat basically anything that could involve that would involve harming a living organism. You're not allowed to, for like the hardcore Jains, you're not allowed to travel by car or plane or boat, because those forms of transportation can easily lead to the harming of, insects, sea creatures, um, other, animals that you would find on a road or in the ocean or in the air, right? So the Jain approach is sort of the maximally ascetic or self-denying approach in the context of South Asian philosophy, whereas Hinduism involves an endorsement of various periods of being very worldly, right? Accruing wealth and resources for yourself and your family. Then Siddhartha Gautama, the founder of Buddhism, the Buddha himself, discovered this supposed middle path between the world attachment the in some cases complete world attachment of Hinduism and complete world detachment of Jainism. Okay. I list out here that Hinduism is also a very complex, nuanced system of thought, that uh, there are six orthodox formations of Hindu philosophy or religion. That is Vedanta, Yoga, Samkhya, Nyaya, Mimamsa, and Vaisheshika. Those are the six orthodox versions of South Asian philosophy or religion, if you will. The reason why they're orthodox is because they all draw upon the Vedic texts, the Vedas, which are the fundamental scriptures of Hinduism. But maybe not exclusively the fundamental structures, the fundamental scriptures. There are the Upanishads as well. There's the Bhagavad Gita. There are additional texts that can be lumped into this foundation of Hinduism. Um, so those are the six orthodox formations of Hindu philosophy. The unorthodox or the heterodox formations of South Asian philosophy are Buddhism and Jainism because they explicitly break from Hinduism and do not draw upon the Vedas for defining their religious and philosophical coordinates. Some of the concepts that are familiar from Hinduism and Jainism. Samsara, which means rebirth, that is being born again or reincarnated. Kaivalya or moksha. Kaivalya means isolation. Moksha means liberation. So the purpose of our existence, according to many of these philosophical systems, is to achieve moksha or the liberation of ourselves from the cycle of reincarnation. And Kaivalya can be a method by which we achieve that liberation, isolating ourselves from the world, from our erroneous sense of self, from other mistaken concepts that we may hold. Self-denial is another component here that to some extent we must deny ourselves the pleasures and benefits and um, resources of this world. We must distance ourselves to an extent from worldly attachment and worldly belongings in order to achieve this enlightened standpoint. Okay, so Buddhism originates from the Buddha, who was Siddhartha Gautama. The story of Siddhartha Gautama goes like this. He was a prince in a very well-to-do royal family, and he lived in his sheltered castle where he possessed everything you could ever imagine for most of his life. And then one day he ventures outside of the castle and he witnesses suffering for the first time. He encounters someone who is sick, he encounters someone who is experiencing old age, and he encounters someone who is dead, a dead body. And at each juncture, he is asking his driver, what am I observing? What am I looking at? I've never seen anything like this before. Someone who is suffering from a lack of basic sustenance or fulfillment of needs like shelter and food and water, or I'm experiencing someone who is suffering from physical mental illness. I'm experiencing someone who is actually dead, who is deceased, no longer exhibiting the signs of life, right? And that was a shell shock for Siddhartha Gautama. That forced him to reflect upon the means by which we can overcome suffering, right? If suffering is an inevitable feature of our existence, how can we eventually overcome it? How can we improve ourselves to the point where we no longer experience suffering? And that, in many ways, is the motivating drive underlying Buddhism. Okay, so after he encounters all these instances of suffering, he devotes himself to the discovery of enlightenment. He begins on a harshly ascetic Jain route of denying himself of almost all worldly goods and services, including basic sustenance. So depriving himself of food and water for extended periods of time without obviously depriving himself too much. He realizes that this is not the correct pathway toward the elimination of suffering and overcoming reincarnation. Instead, he decides that the middle path or way should be pursued. And the middle path is a compromise position, in a way, between the extreme asceticism of Jainism and the worldliness of Hinduism. So Buddhism requires a detachment from the world, but not a full-fledged detachment in the sense of what the Jains experience or what they pursue and strive for. In Buddhism, there are the Four Noble. Oh, and the Buddha received this enlightenment, this insight, underneath the Bodhi tree, which is why the Bodhi tree is so significant in Buddhism. Four Noble Truths. These are supposedly the basic principles by which all Buddhists organize their efforts and their understanding of reality. One, there is suffering. Suffering is translated from the word dukkha. Notice that this does not say only human beings suffer, or I am suffering, or we are suffering. It is just there exists this thing called suffering, which is detached from any particular person, particular group, or even specifications to organisms generally, right? So there is suffering, quite a broad statement, but one that I think everyone can get on board with. Two, there is an origin to suffering. That is, there is a beginning to suffering as a condition. It's important to identify the beginning because if we can identify the beginning of suffering, we know how it emerges or how it comes into being. If we can identify the causes and conditions that precede the emergence of suffering in our lives, then we can overcome, avoid, eliminate those causes and conditions which produce suffering in the first place. And that is much of what Buddhism strives to do, is through an analysis which is called dependent origination, which seeks to understand the causes and conditions behind the existence of all things, which undermines our erroneous conceptions of reality, and then we are able to fully embrace what there is, which is this constantly changing flux of ourselves and what we call substances or things, and that allows us to detach ourselves from the world in a proper manner. Okay. Three, there is a cessation to suffering. There is an end to suffering. Okay, so there's a beginning and there's an end. Our goal is to find why suffering begins in the first place and then understand how it can be ended finally. Four, there is a path for achieving the cessation of suffering, which is called the Noble Eightfold Path or the Middle Way. Okay. You might ask yourself, this is fine and all, but what exactly do the Buddhists mean by suffering? What is involved in suffering? Generally, Buddhists delineate between three types of suffering. First is natural suffering, which is basically what it sounds like. It is the suffering of birth, pain, old age, and death. You might find birth to be a strange addition to this list, but if you think about the conditions of birth it's themselves, birth is quite a traumatic experience, both for the one who is giving birth and the one who is born, right? For the one who is born, it involves being pushed out of or forced out of a comfortable womb-like atmosphere where all of your needs are satisfied, where you are perfectly comfortable, and being pushed out into this world that is completely unfamiliar to you, right? So birth to the Buddhists is a painful experience. It's a form of suffering, not only for the one giving birth, but also for the one who is born. Pain, old age, death, sickness, any kind of suffering that arises from the ordinary course of human life. Two, the suffering of expectation. So natural suffering is obviously more difficult to overcome in that regard because it's baked into the structure of what it means to be human. Right. But then again, the Buddha never said this would be easy. He never said it would be easy to overcome suffering and achieve liberation from reincarnation. Two is the suffering of expectations. This refers to the fact that we hold expectations for how things will be or how we want them to be, and those expectations are unreasonable and out of tune with reality, and that sets us up for suffering. So the suffering of expectations is grounded in avoidable psychological constructs like the belief in permanence, the self, etc. Let me give you some examples. I might start a relationship with someone, whether that be like a friendship, a romantic relationship, whatever it is. And I think that the relationship is going to last forever, right? I don't contemplate or consider or ponder the termination of that relationship at some point, which is inevitable. Either the relationship dissolves on its own, one person in the relationship dissolves, or both people in the relationship dissolve, right? But there will be an end to that relationship. So because I delude myself into thinking that the relationship will last forever, I set myself up for the suffering that accompanies the loss of that relationship. So because I expect this relationship to happen to last forever, then I lay the groundwork for the causes and conditions that produce my suffering in the first place. Okay. Um, there are so many ways in which we expect things to be, and that produces suffering for us, right? We think that if we get the best job, the best house, the best car, the best spouse, whatever it may be, we think that that will fulfill us, that will leave us entirely satisfied and fulfilled with our existence, and then eventually we realize that such material entities or such temporary, insubstantial, ephemeral, passing phenomena, we realize that those never fully satisfy us. And that produces suffering in itself, is the expectation that something will completely satisfy us. And then it doesn't, that produces discomfort within ourselves. Okay. So the manner by which we overcome the suffering of expectations is to revise our expectations, is to reformulate our expectations on the basis of a correct conception of reality, which takes impermanence and insubstantiality and transitoriness into account. Okay. The suffering of all conditions is another type of suffering that Buddhists sometimes talk about. This is sort of analogous to the butterfly effect, where some small event happens in the world and then a very large event happens somewhere else in the world. So the butterfly effect is the belief that, a butterfly flapping its wings in one part of the world could contribute to or produce a hurricane on the other side of the world. This belief that all natural events are interconnected, intertwined with one another, and have an impact on each other. Buddhists believe this is also a way that suffering takes place, and contemporary Buddhists in particular are focused on the impact of individual decisions on climate change, on anthropogenic or human-caused climate change more generally. So the suffering of all conditions is a matter of analyzing the broader structures or systems in our existence and how they influence individual lives. Okay, so that's simply what the Buddhists mean by suffering, and that's important because you know one obvious objection to Buddhism is that, okay, there are individuals who claim to have achieved nirvana either in this life or will achieve nirvana in the next life, or just in terms of an escape from reincarnation, but it seems like they still experience pain, right? How is it possible for an individual to achieve an enlightened standing like the Buddha himself and Dalai Lama and yet to still experience pain? The Buddhists differentiate pain from suffering. Pain is, yes, this physiological response that is registered in our minds and that we feel in our bodies. But the step from pain to suffering requires us to identify with that pain. It requires us to allow that pain to become a component of who we are, or to understand that pain as belonging to some enduring substantial self, which does not exist for the Buddhists. So, yes, it is possible for an individual who is enlightened to experience pain, but pain is not equivalent with suffering for the Buddhists. Suffering results from incorrect conceptions of reality that result in us binding ourselves to this thing called the self, this thing called the world, um, and erroneously believing that the acquisition of material goods will sufficiently provide for our happiness. Right? Okay. Additional doctrines ordinarily found within Buddhism: the doctrine of impermanence, that all things are impermanent, all things change, nothing ever stays exactly the same or identical with itself forever. We'll discuss this more next time in the next lecture. The doctrine of insubstantiality, that we tend to think surrounding us and ourselves, we tend to think that we and other entities qualify as substances. That is what stands underneath a collection of accidents or attributes, right? To take a water bottle, for instance, right? The water bottle we think is a substance unto itself. It is its own thing, right? But the water bottle also possesses attributes and aspects and accidents, right? It has a certain colored top. It has a certain colored body. It has this for holding the water bottle in a particular way. And the Buddhists will say the issue that arises is that when we say that this thing is a substance, we think that this thing, exactly as it is, persists throughout time. But the Buddhists will say the water bottle changes from moment to moment or from day to day, right? It sheds certain parts of itself, it develops scratches, its color fades, right? So there is no, for the Buddhists, perfectly self-identical encapsulated being that persists for all time. Instead, the water bottle arises from prior causes and conditions, and it will serve as causes and conditions for further events in the future or further entities in the future. So we are mistaken to believe that anything is permanent and there is any um, enduring, self-enclosed, perfectly encapsulated substance, right? And I will unpack what that means more as we progress through this lecture and the lecture for Wednesday. The doctrine of no self is absolutely essential for Buddhists. This is the belief that there is no permanent, enduring, substantial self with which I can identify. myself, right? Um, this is not to say that I don't exist. This is not to say that, we are skeptical as a result of your own existence, of the entire world. Instead, it's a far narrower claim, which is that there is no soul, basically. In the West, we utilize this notion of soul as that which I fundamentally and essentially am. Or we think of ourselves maybe in more contemporary terms as like the real me, the me that's deep down inside that not many people know, right? And for the Buddhists, there is no real you. There is no deep down you. There is no soul that is perfectly identical with you. Instead, you are a collection or a cluster of parts that are constantly changing. Your consciousness, your body, your mental faculties like memory, like your perceptual faculties, right? Your eyesight, your hearing, it's constantly changing, constantly fluctuating. And so the Buddhists will say that it's not possible for you to identify one element of the self and the self, by the way, for the Buddhist, is a construct. It is something that we create from a variety of parts, like the body and the mind, and purportedly the soul. The Buddhists will say that you cannot identify anything that remains exactly identical with itself throughout time, forever and ever, right? And as a result, there is no ultimate self, right? There is a conventional self. Like it's easier for us to refer to one another by name, right? Like Jason or Jack, whatever, right? Like it's easier for me to designate an individual as a self through a name because that's convenient. But that doesn't mean underlying that name, there is some substantial self that persists throughout time in a perfectly identical manner. Okay. This is translated from the Sanskrit anatman. Atman means it's one of the words for self. An is a negation, so it's anatman, no self. Doctrine of emptiness is very similar. It's basically the universalization of the doctrine of no self to all things. Previously, I was only talking about, human beings. We believe that we have some essential core self that remains identical with itself throughout our entire lives. But in fact, there is no such thing. Right. The person that I am today is very different than the person I was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. To assert that I am exactly the same person would be ridiculous. I've had different experiences. I've met different people. I've lived in different places. And all of those influence my sense of self and my and the way in which myself expresses itself, right? Okay, so the doctrine of emptiness is a universalization of the doctrine of no self to all entities, right? So it's not just that me, a human being, has no essential substantial self. It's that this water bottle has no essential substantial self. That this book has no essential substantial self that remains perfectly identical with itself throughout time. And the uh, the point here is that no entity, regardless of what it is, possesses its own being, right? Possesses its being independently of its surroundings, its context, its conditions and causes through which it became an entity in the first place. So it lacks svabhava, which means own being. Sva, own, bhava, being. So the argument from the Buddhists, the Buddhists, it's mostly Mahayana Madhyamaka Buddhists who adopt this position of the doctrine of emptiness, like Nagarjuna or Shantideva, who are, respectively, second century and eighth century CE Buddhists, who are very famous in the Madhyamaka school of Buddhism. But the but the upshot is that no thing possesses being from its own side. Everything borrows being from prior causes and conditions. So this water bottle did not come into being as its own. It came into being from a variety of parts. Those parts came into being from prior causes and conditions, and so on and so on. Right? The water bottle is not a self-enclosed entity independently of its context and surroundings. You are not a self-enclosed entity independently of your context and surroundings. And so it would be erroneous or fallacious to assert that you are this independent, self-substantial, self-subsisting entity that is independent of everything around you and prior causes and conditions. Okay. So hopefully you are receiving this picture of Buddhism as emphasizing a holism, right? That we ought to understand entities or people with respect to their context, their situations, their surroundings, the conditions through which they emerged. The last doctrine that I will mention for Buddhism, and again, we'll discuss all of these throughout the remaining lecture and next time, the distinction between conventional and ultimate reality. That, as I mentioned previously, in conventional reality, which is the reality that we construct for the sake of being practical and efficient and expedient, in conventional reality, we have these things called selves. Like myself is designated by my name, and I have a driver's license, and I have government documentation that designates the identity of myself, right? But that's all for convenience. That's for the sake of me being able to travel quickly, be identifiable by the government, be able to introduce myself to others without listing out all of my attributes and properties. Um, ultimate reality is a different perspective, right? So conventionally, we can say, yes, there is this self called Jason. But from an ultimate standpoint, there is no enduring, substantial, permanent self that is called Jason. Okay, so from an ultimate reality perspective, we have to understand what actually exists. In order to do that, we must disabuse ourselves of the fallacious notions of a self or permanence or substantiality or fullness as opposed to emptiness and so on. Okay, so the purpose of Buddhism, the upshot of the entirety of the Buddhist endeavor is to liberate yourself from reincarnation and to eliminate suffering. You desire either complete annihilation or transcendence to nirvana. And the view is not always clear within Buddhism, whether we are seeking some type of annihilation of the self, where we are just completely eliminating who we are, right? And the Buddhists will sometimes mention immortality along these lines, that what it means to be immortal is not to live forever in a heavenly beyond where there is no death. It means for the Buddhists that you cannot die again because you are not reborn, right? If you're constantly being reborn in new cycles of existence, and then you're, you know, removed from from those continuous cycles of existence, if you're cast out of that, then you no longer exist, and it's not possible for you to die again because you haven't been born again, and that would be immortality, right? So if you see immortality in these South Asian contexts for Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, do not import, I think, the Judeo-Christian view, which is, oh, immortality is the fact the soul lives on forever, independently of the body in some kind of heavenly beyond or realm. That's not necessarily the case for the Buddhists, right? For some of them, it's a question of actually annihilating, eliminating the self, ridding ourselves of ourselves. And again, not in like a way that you are destroying yourself, not in like a suicidal way, but in a way that like you have set up the conditions of your existence in order to liberate yourself from reincarnation, so that when you die in this cycle of existence, you are not reborn in the next. Okay. A prior condition, the right view or a correct understanding of reality. The Buddhists emphasize correct beliefs about reality as a precondition for liberation from reincarnation. This is the field of philosophy we discussed last week called epistemology, which means the study of knowledge, the study of belief, belief formation, justified belief, truth. So the Buddhist epistemology, first and foremost, will establish the correct beliefs that we should adopt about reality, like the fact that there is no self, like the fact that like the fact that there sorry like the fact that there is no substance, there is no permanence in reality. So an epistemic shift is required before the achievement of salvation. Moreover, the epistemic shift accompanied by cultivation of virtuous conduct. So not only are we changing our conception of reality, but as a result of changing our conception of reality, we will also adopt various virtues that assist us in being compassionate towards other beings. Because even though, right, this is where the complexity of Buddhism really begins, even though there is no self, even though there is no permanent, enduring, substantial, self-identical self, there is still reincarnation. There is still suffering. Now, the complex question is what or who is being reincarnated if there is no self, and what or who is suffering if there is no self. And much ink has been spilt on those exact questions, right? How does Buddhism reconcile the apparently contradictory or paradoxical beliefs that there is no self, there is no substance, there is no permanence, and yet there is reincarnation and there is suffering? Okay, um, how do those coalesce with one another without producing an inconsistency of some kind? But the proper virtues of Buddhism are loving kindness, compassion, joy, equanimity. Equanimity being just like tranquility, neutrality, sort of peacefulness in the mind. right? Not having not having an overactive mind or an overwhelmed mind. Like when you think that your mind is going a million miles an hour, that's the opposite of equanimity, right? Equanimity is supposed to be a peacefulness, a tranquility, a calmness of the mind. Okay. So, what we understand as essential or permanent substances receive the designation of skandhas or aggregates by Buddhists, right? These skandhas or aggregates are usually consist of material form, and I guess this is confined to the human being, not so much to non-human entities or non-organisms. The material form, affective sensations, perceptions, mental activity, and consciousness. So, as I mentioned in the beginning of the lecture, there are many schools of thought along these lines. One school of thought is the Abhidharma school of thought in Buddhism, which says that there are some irreducible aspects of reality that do achieve ultimately real existence. So, for instance, each slice or sliver of consciousness is a is an irreducible entity unto itself and is ultimately real. Okay. The claim from the Mahayana Madhyamaka Buddhists is that there is nothing that is ultimately real. Everything is empty, and even emptiness itself is not ultimately real. Okay. So the Abhidharmas will say that we can reduce each of these skandhas to some basic element that cannot be reduced any further and thus qualifies as ultimately real. That is where the Madhyamaka Buddhists will disagree with the Abhidharmas and say, no, there is no ultimately real entity. What you think is ultimately real still borrows its being from prior causes and conditions, and thus nothing stands as ultimately real or full or possessing its own being, right? Okay. Um, so generally, when we're talking about the self, Buddhists think we're talking about a cluster of these five things: a material form, a body; affective sensations, that is the ability to sense things around me; perceptions, mental activity, like remembering, like counting, like thinking generally; and consciousness. The issue for the Buddhists is that none of these five things stays exactly the same with itself. In fact, they are all constantly changing. What I am conscious of is changing. The character of my mental activity is changing. What I am perceiving and sensing is changing. And my body is changing. Right? Involving the shedding of skin cells, involving the growing of my hair, and so on. Okay. All right. So the doctrine of emptiness does not allow for anything to be considered atomic in the proper sense, as possessing its own being or intrinsic nature. So figures who espouse this view are Nagarjuna and Shantideva, who I mentioned earlier. They both argue that that ultimate reality does not apply to any entities whatsoever. That at a fundamental level, all things are empty, and we cannot allow emptiness to become an ultimate reality. Right. The point of Buddhism for these Madhyamaka thinkers is to eliminate that tendency within ourselves to find something and hypostatize it or make it its own being, make it its own entity that is permanent and substantial and so on. We must rid ourselves of that notion because that's not true of anything in existence. Okay, and then the last point on the slide mentions dependent origination, but I think at this point you understand what that means. It is the fact that we should analyze all entities from the perspective of their prior causes and conditions that contribute being to that entity. So we have the construct of the self, for instance, and the self dependently originates from these five different elements, these five elements that construct an aggregate, right? Okay. The last thing we'll discuss for today's lecture, and the next time we will continue with our coverage of Buddhism, is the immediate traditional objections raised against Buddhism. And this is what I mentioned earlier with the question of how do we resolve the belief in reincarnation, the belief in suffering, that someone or something suffers, that there is suffering according to the first of the Four Noble Truths. How to reconcile those two beliefs in the existence of suffering, the existence of reincarnation, with, on the other hand, the belief in the existence of no self, the belief in emptiness, the belief in insubstantiality and impermanence. If there is ultimately no self, then what is being reincarnated? If there ultimately is no self, then what is suffering? Right. Additionally, Buddhism adopts the doctrine of karma, which precedes Buddhism and is found in Hinduism and Jainism as well. Karma is sort of a misunderstood concept in various aspects of Hinduism and Buddhism. Karma does not always refer to the fact that you do bad things and then bad things happen to you, right? What goes around comes around. That's not really the conception of karma that many Buddhist and Hindu philosophers work with. Instead, the notion of karma that many Buddhists and Hindus endorse is that if you believe that you are the author of your actions, if you believe that there is some permanent substantial self behind the scenes who is orchestrating and organizing all events and all actions, that type of belief is what produces karma. That type of belief is what causes reincarnation. The k root in karma is the root for action in Sanskrit, right? K means something like to act, right? And so if you act with incorrect conceptions about reality, according to the Buddhists, then you will set yourself up for reincarnation. So karma is not necessarily I do horrible things in this life and in future lives I experience horrible things as a result. Instead, it is I incorrectly approach action as belonging to some permanent substantial self or to some fulfilled non-empty entity. And as a result of those mistaken, erroneous beliefs about reality, I then produce the conditions for my reincarnation. Okay. So how do the Buddhists account for this? Well, we will discuss this in more detail next time, but just to give you a primer on how I will articulate the Buddhist response to these objections. Basically, the Buddhists are not denying that there is no self entirely, right? There is obviously, they do assert the existence of these skandhas, these aggregates, which consist of body, uh, a mind with the ability to sense, perceive, engage in mental activity, and be conscious. And so, roughly, even though ourselves are not entirely identical from one moment to the next, they are similar to instances. They are similar to prior instances. So, for instance, like from lecture to lecture, you may notice that like my appearance has changed. Maybe I'm wearing a different outfit. Maybe I'm in a different context. Whatever. Um, and but you're still able to recognize me as a person based on my voice, based on my physical presentation, based on my mannerisms. And so there's a degree of similarity that continues across my existence, right? I'm not completely unidentifiable and undifferentiatable, uh, you know, from prior instances of my existence, right? Like you can see a picture of me as a child and you're like, oh, I see the resemblance between you as a child and you now. So there's a persistence of self, but just not in terms of identity, instead in terms of similarity. This is why I said earlier that the doctrine of no self is actually a very narrow view. It's not that there is no self whatsoever, right? That like that there is nothing to the word self. Instead, it is a rejection of a very particular conception of the self, which is in our Western language most likely the conception of a soul, right? So Buddhism rejects the idea of a soul, but it doesn't reject the idea that there are similar instances of yourself that are causally connected throughout time. Okay. So that is what allows for reincarnation to take place. That is what allows for suffering to take place and karma to take place, is that based on my activities within this life, the causal sequences that I produce on the basis of my actions. Again, I'm using my there, but you have to be very careful with the my, the me, the I in Buddhism from an ultimately real perspective. Anyway, based on the causal consequences of my actions, um, those causal sequences will follow me into the next life. And that's another way of thinking about karma, right? So yes, I'm not saying that the ordinary conception of karma is incorrect. It just needs to be slightly revised to take into account this broader sense of karma as an incorrect attitude, an incorrect belief, also factoring into whether reincarnation takes place and how it takes place. Okay, so the similarity of the self is the crucial point for the Buddhists that allows for the saving of the doctrine of reincarnation, doctrine of karma, and the doctrine of suffering. Okay, that will do it for today. We will continue our discussion of Buddhism next time.